ACNFers, it's official. Promotional support for the podcast is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference, celebrating its 26th year on the last weekend of March 2025, the 28th and the 29th. 300 to 400 journalists from around the world are coming. Keynote speakers include Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, and Dan Zach. They're all going to deliver the knowledge, man. They're going to bring the heat. Listeners of this podcast can get 15% off your enrollment fee by using the code CNF15. To learn more, visit combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code. I'll be there. I'll be doing the thing. Yeah, your boy B.O.
The fan brain and the critic brain, they work together.
Oh, hey, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara. We've got Stephen Hyden today, at Stephen_Hyden, writer on Instagram. He returns to the show to talk about There Was Nothing You Could Do, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the U.S.A. and the End of the Heartland. It's published by Hachette Books. Stephen Hyden is a music critic for Uproxx. He's the producer of Break Stuff, the amazing podcast about Woodstock 99. He's a story producer for the documentary Yacht Rock. He's the author of Twilight of the Gods, This Isn't Happening, Hard to Handle, and Long Road. And for Stephen, he keeps his critic brain and his fan brain fully intact. One needs the other. Gosh, we recorded this back in June 2024, and I'm just about caught up with the really old recordings. I've got one more from around that time. In this episode, Stephen and I talk about connections in culture, how a critic has the power to ruin a band or an album for you, and losing control of a generational narrative. Really great chat about Pearl Jam, also the Long Road book, his Bruce book, of course, and writing a book that provides context to the current time and the era it was forged. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can find blog post services, and you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. I raffle off books to active subscribers. Also, there are literally dozens of pending subscriptions. That means you need to confirm you're signing up, since there's that two-step verification thing going on. Anyway, first of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. You can't definitively beat it. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an interview. I know you're not going to listen to everyone, but subscribing, it doesn't cost you a thing. Unless you wanted to, because then you can go to patreon.com/CNFpod, and it will cost you a thing. Anyway, we got a new rating on Apple Podcasts. Not sure what the rating was. I just noticed there was another one. No written review, so I can't tell. But that's a reminder to leave a kind review, and I'll read it right here. Even a mean one. I read a mean one not too long ago. I don't care. I don't give a fuck. They validate the show for the wayward CNFer. The kind ones, anyway. I have no name recognition or celebrity. You know that. So seeing a bunch of reviews gives the show the benefit of the doubt. Bada. Parting shot today about minimalism and being a writer. What? But first, you're in for a great time with Stephen Hyden. Go by and put it under the tree. There was nothing you could do for the boss fan in your life. Here we go. Riff. The reception to Break Stuff continue. It's been a few years since that came out, and that was when we first spoke. But what was the reaction to that as that series came to a head?
The Woodstock?
Yeah.
It did well. I think people liked it. I don't know if we talked about this at the time, but when I pitched it, I thought it was going to be on The Ringer, and they ended up putting it in. God, I can't even remember the name of the service now.
Yeah, Luminary.
Luminary, that's it.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they're still around. But that was a little disappointing just because it shrunk the audience, I think, for the show.
Oh, for sure.
I think it would have had a much bigger impact if it had been on The Ringer. But
And I will poke in here already. Break Stuff, the Woodstock 99 epic documentary podcast, if you want to call it that, is with The Ringer now on Spotify. So accessible to more people, and it's awesome. It's so good. And you can go back to our previous conversation from several years ago and catch some insights into it from that rodeo. But great stuff and more accessible. I think Luminary is still doing their thing, but there was a paywall with it, and I remember at the time I had to get a week-long trial and just try to binge as much of it as I could, and then cancel my subscription so I could talk intelligently about Break Stuff.
As it was, I think the people that heard it definitely liked it, and then a few years later, The Ringer actually made a documentary about Woodstock '99 that I got to be involved in a little bit, and just behind the scenes, and then I was interviewed for it too. So that was kind of a cool sequel to the whole thing.
An overall question about being a music critic, and this is something I relate to as a sports writer, and how being a sports writer kind of fundamentally changed my relationship to sports and viewing sports. And I wonder for you, just in terms of being a cultural music critic, how it fundamentally altered your relationship to music just as a fan. Then it becomes kind of your vocation and you have to look at it differently.
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's funny because I've in a way been a music critic for almost as long as I've been a music fan. I wrote my first record review for my junior high paper in 8th grade. I reviewed Automatic for the People by REM and Dirt by Alice in Chains. So I was 14 when that happened. By the following year, I was reviewing records for my local newspaper, the daily newspaper. Obviously, it wasn't my full-time job, but I was thinking in those terms already. So I don't know. It's hard for me to say what I would be like if I didn't write about music. I mean, certainly the thing that being a music critic allows me to do is to listen to music and think about music a lot more than I would otherwise. And that's true also of writing books. I mean, one of the great things about writing a book about Bruce Springsteen is that it gives you an excuse to dive back into this catalog that I love so much, and to listen to bootlegs and to, read all these books, where it might be difficult to do that if I wasn't making money doing it. If I had to just focus on what I was doing in my daily job, which is listening to new music. Writing this book, it's like a ticket. It's an excuse or whatever to do these things that I want to do anyway. So I don't know. For me, it always is kind of fed into the other. I know some people say well, if I think about it too much, I can't enjoy it on the same kind of visceral level that you can as a fan. But I really don't find that to be the case. I think that if you're going to write about music effectively, you have to protect that fan part of yourself. You still do have to have emotional reactions to things, or else you're just writing about this from a purely intellectual level. And I don't think that the best writing is ever like that. For me, it always starts with an emotional reaction, and then you try to figure out, well, why do I feel this way? What is prompting this? And that's when the critical brain kicks in. But I don't know. To me, the fan brain and the critic brain, they work together.
How many times does it take you to, let's say you've got a new album to listen to and you have to write however many words about it? How many times do you need to listen to something to properly metabolize it and be able to write about it critically and intellectually?
Well, there's not a set number. It's not okay, I have to do 8 times and then I'm ready to go. Sometimes you don't have that much time to write your column because the album came out on a Friday. There was no advance promo of the record, and you have to listen to it over the weekend and write something by like Monday or Tuesday. So you may not have as many listens. I mean, I think you really have to understand whenever you write about anything that there's never going to be the right opinion that you arrive at. You know, there's never going to be a moment where you're like, aha, I get it now. That is always evolving. So that thing that you write, it's just a snapshot of how you felt in the moment. And I don't care if you've listened to it 3 times or 300 times. It's very likely that in a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years that you're not going to feel the exact same way that you did when you wrote that thing. And I think that's okay. You know, I mean, there is no such thing, I think, as a definitive opinion, even for yourself. I mean, it's natural for things to settle in over time. You know,
Yeah.
if you have more time with an album, you have a relationship with it, you kind of figure out, like, okay, this is how I feel about it. You know, it's funny. I just wrote something about my best albums of 2010 list that I did for the AV Club, you know, years ago. And like the number one album on that list, I hadn't listened to in like over 10 years, you know?
Yeah.
And when I revisited it, I thought it was okay, but I didn't love it, you know? But does that mean I was wrong in 2010? Not really. I mean, because when I wrote it, that's how I felt. It was a reflection of my life at that moment. So it was right. It was right in 2010. It's just that I don't feel the same way now. So again, I just think if you're someone who kind of puts yourself out there, you have to accept that you are in a constant state of evolution, and no matter what you write, no matter how well prepared you are, there's a good chance that's going to change, and you're going to disagree with yourself somewhere down the line.
Regarding books like the you know just your most recent ones on Pearl Jam and Springsteen, and specifically, yeah, Pearl Jam's more career, and then Springsteen's born in the USA, and what that came to symbolize. When you're coming to write a book of this nature, what does the research and the reporting look like, and how does that operate? Curating that information, where you're finding it, who you're talking to, and how you formulate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the books I write, obviously there is there's like the primary material, which is like the records themselves. Like you're listening to that stuff and you're diving in, and there may be a biography of the band, or there might be like magazine articles. You're diving in all that stuff, all the kind of basic biographical information. Like for me, like I'm a music critic, and I feel like one of the things that critics do is put a work of art in a larger context. So you're not just talking about that album or that film or whatever. You're talking about the world around whatever it is you're writing about. So that means what's going on culturally, what's going on politically, what's going on in like other areas of like that field, which in this case is rock music. And I think that is what takes sort of a critical review beyond just sort of a simple like Wikipedia type entry. Because look, with Bruce, it's very easy to find out like how he made Born in the USA. I mean, you can look that up and Google it, and that information isn't hard to find. What I hope that this book provides is a certain perspective on the record that maybe hasn't been shared before, where you are getting a sense of like where he came from when he was making this record, and where he went afterward, and what else was going on in music around him, and how music changed after this record came out, and what was going on in America, and how America changed. More of a bird's eye view of the record. I think that's true of the books I write. It's what I aspire to do. And I think ultimately you just have to keep your antenna up, because you're really looking for things that aren't just, again, part of the biography of the record, things that kind of go beyond that and maybe are connected to the record, but in a way that people might not otherwise recognize. I mean, that's the thing I'm always looking for. So like in this book, for instance, I knew going in that Bruce got the album title from a screenplay by Paul Schrader, the great screenwriter and director. Well, how do Paul Schrader's films link up with Bruce Springsteen's albums? And digging into it, I thought, there's actually quite a few parallels thematically between what Paul Schrader was doing in the late 70s and early 80s and what Bruce was doing. So that becomes a thing to write about, or writing about how CCR influenced Bruce and how that informed Born in the USA. Things like that. And that's the stuff that excites me when I'm writing a book, finding those connections in culture and just telling a story that's about more than just like one record, but is, maybe like a grander story, that can give people a new perspective on what it is you're writing about.
Right. I love that you bring in kind of the influence, let's say, that informed Born in the USA, and no creative person or band or whatever is isolated or even 100% original. Like, there is a family tree that they descend from. And I wonder, just a slight tweak on that, like if we pivot to writers that and books that inspired you, what are some of the family tree that helped informed you as a writer, and for the kind of books that you take on?
A big book for me in terms of like music writing or culture writing when I was growing up was Mystery Train by Grail Marcus, which, for those who don't know, it's this collection of essays where he's writing about artists like the band, Randy Newman, Sly Stone, Elvis Presley. And it's this book about American music, but he's really using music writing as a vehicle to talk about a lot of other things. He's really digging into like American history and drawing connections between these different artists. And it was such a mind-blowing book for me growing up, because I realized that you could use music writing as a vehicle to talk about anything. You could start with a record, but then you could end up talking about the Gettysburg Address or something, or whatever the case may be. And as long as you could make the case in your writing for this being valid, you can pull it off. It doesn't matter if it's something that wouldn't be obvious to anyone else before they read this book. So that was very inspiring to me as a young writer, and it's certainly something that I aspired to and probably still aspire to. So that was a big one. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, people like Chuck Klosterman and Rob Sheffield, who I think kind of invented the sort of books that I write. I mean, in terms of taking that widescreen approach, but then writing in a very kind of conversational, often comedic style, but also like with a lot of heart at the same time.
Yeah.
I think Rob's book, Dreaming the Beatles, I always end up looking at that a little bit, like when I'm working on a book. I feel like that format is something that has definitely informed what I do. I also have to give a shout out to Ellen Willis, who I think is one of the great rock critics of all time. And she doesn't really get mentioned as much as like Lester Bangs or, Grail Marcus, who I said before, but I think she is definitely in the same class of writers. I mean, one of the first epigraph in the Springsteen book is from Ellen Willis, something she wrote about Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll. She's a great writer, and she's a writer that, like, you can read her stuff from the 70s and it feels like someone wrote it last week. She has a very contemporary voice, unlike someone like Lester Bangs, who I love, but he's very much rooted in the 70s. I mean, if you wrote like Lester Bangs now, people would accuse you of being like a Lester Bangs impersonator. I mean, there's just how slangy he is, and like how that kind of like hepped up beat poetry type of writing. I mean, it's great when he does it, but it doesn't translate to a modern voice at all. Whereas Ellen Willis, I think, totally does. So those writers come to mind in terms of like music writing for sure. Cool. For me.
Awesome. Yeah. And speaking of Chuck, and his recent book being the 90s, a book, 90s is something of our wheelhouse. You're just a couple years older than I am. Like my middle school and high school years are fully enveloped in the 90s. So, and the 90s are kind of having, their moment, so to speak. It's been 30 years since, 25, 30 years since that decade. So now there's that cultural remove where you can really critically analyze it. So what has that meant to you as a Gen Xer to be able to have this '90s moment to be able to lock into.
Well, it's interesting where as you get older, you realize that you don't have control over your own past, that there's a younger generation that comes along that is going to look at the culture that you grew up with, and they're going to have their own opinions on it, and they're going to decide what bands are better than other bands. And sometimes they're going to pick bands that you thought were not that great, and they're going to decide, oh, these are the best bands of that
Of a
time.
generation, yeah.
Yeah, and like you see with the '90s now, like where people love Sublime, they love No Doubt, they love Third Eye Blind. I mean, these are the bands that I hear younger people talking about much more so than like Modest Mouse or Built to Spill. Although Built to Spill gets a lot of love, I think, from younger people. But so that's a little weird sometimes to see that happen. But I'm also a person who has written about bands from the '60s and '70s, and sometimes the bands that people my age love are not the bands that the people who grew up with those bands love, or they don't like certain albums that people my age love. I mean, I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and there's people my age are like, oh, I love Street Legal, and I love Infidels, and I love all these albums that critics at the time sort of shrugged off. So people my age have done it to the boomers, and now people, millennials or Zoomers, whatever, they're doing it to the Gen Xers. So that's just part of the circle of life, I guess. I mean, these things happen, but that is a fascinating thing to me.
Yeah.
When you see your own past, it's like, oh yeah, I don't have control of this narrative anymore.
Right.
Someone else is, someone who wasn't there. They're in control of the narrative. They outnumber people my age, so they can decide that, and you just have to accept that. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, I love how you write in Long Road. The pathology of my generation is that we hate ourselves and anything we see ourselves in, and few things about the '90s seem more universally us than Pearl Jam.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And how like Pearl Jam is a band that I don't see translating to younger audiences. I mean, they were so hugely important in the '90s compared to like Nirvana or something. I see Nirvana T-shirts all the
Oh
time.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's like when people my age were wearing Beatles shirts in the '90s, and you still see people wearing Beatles shirts now, obviously. But Nirvana has just totally overwhelmed like most of the rock bands. I feel like of the '90s. I mean, like that is the band, and then everyone else is sort of overlooked. But it totally makes sense. I mean, Nirvana's a great band. I love Nirvana, and they also just have an incredible story that's very romantic. So, in a very kind of dark and tragic way, of course, but in music, those are often the most romantic stories, the most tragic ones.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there are moments where you write that how certain music kind of locks you into a certain time in your life, and as good as say an album like Versus is, like right around that time when it came out, whatever it was, 92 or 93. I was just in the early middle school, and I have like such a profound distaste for those years.
Right.
And Daughter was so overly played on the radio, as was the live version of the Eagles Hotel California and like Meatloaf at the time. It was so when I hear those songs, I get like it's like so depressed when I hear them, even though they're like, they're good songs. Speaking of Pearl Jam, which is more of a band of my taste, but it's just like one of those things. Like I can't appreciate that song because it just sends me into like this black pit of teenage angst.
Yeah, and I think Eddie Vedder's voice became a genre unto itself in the '90s. There were so many people that adopted that voice, and
The Jarl.
they really exaggerated it, and it became a cliche for shitty rock bands to have a singer that sounded like that, and that obviously ends up blowing back on Pearl Jam. Just and I say this with love because I love the band, but there is like a histrionic aspect to certainly those early Pearl Jam songs, like the emotional expression in those songs. It's very big and operatic, and there are no musicians really that express themselves that way. This is a very kind of restrained time. I mean, there's so many people that are writing about their feelings and depression and darkness and all that, but in terms of the delivery, it's like relatively restrained. I mean, you know, like guitars are not as loud. People don't really scream as much as they did in the 90s. They're more likely to whisper their vocal than they are to
Mm.
scream it at this point. So a lot of like what Pearl Jam does, it's just out of fashion, and it's in a way the opposite of like the way music is now. So I don't know, maybe that'll turn at some point. I'll be curious to see, but yeah,
Yeah.
they're pretty locked into that time, even though they've transcended it, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, oh for sure. And there's a moment in the book too where you write about this idea of a comeback album and a We're Back album.
Right.
And I love that idea, that concept. And there is a distinct dichotomy, and rarely do the two like completely overlap. But I was wondering, maybe you can expand on that and you know, of what the two mean.
Yeah, well, you know, in Long Road, I talk about comeback album versus We're Back album. A comeback album being an album that reestablishes an artist in the culture. You know, people are like, "Oh, this is a great record. Uh, you know, your best album since yada yada yada." And then there's the We're Back record, which is kind of like a comeback record, but it's really like where you're trying to remind people of the records that they loved a long time ago, and it's really an opportunity to like tee up a tour, you know, more than like have an album unto itself be a major moment. And I think most bands end up doing the We're Back record, you know, where you hear a song on the radio or on the streaming service and you're like, oh, yeah, that kind of reminds me of a song that they did when I really loved this band. And it's not as good, but like it reminds me why I like this band. Maybe I'm going to go buy a concert ticket. That's probably closer to like what the last Pearl Jam record was than a comeback record. Although I like that record that they did, Dark Matter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it is probably more like a We're Back record than a full on comeback album. I mean, Bruce Springsteen, to his credit, I think has made pretty different records as he's gotten older. They're not all successful artistically, but he's not really evoking like any specific era from his past on his sort of 21st century records. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, Letter to You, his most recent studio record of original material, he had that Soul Covers record that came out afterward, but Letter to You has some older songs on it that he took out of the vaults and re-recorded. Some of those songs sound like 70s songs because they are from the 70s, but I don't know. He's not doing like a overt homage to like Born to Run or Born in the USA or anything like that. So, you know, I think he has been pretty thoughtful about not just sort of regurgitating things that people associate with him.
Well, it's kind of like what you write at some point in the book. I forget exactly where, but it's where Bruce more or less articulated that, you know, he sees his life, but also his music as as an unfolding of his ongoing story, and an album is like a slice of where he is at that time in his continuum. So it stands to reason that it'll grow and reflect who he is at that moment.
Right. I mean, he's had an interesting later career because I don't think he's quite made a record that is as acclaimed as like what Bob Dylan has done. You know, I feel like he's put out a couple records that really have kind of reset like how people think of him in the last 25 years. And I don't know if Bruce has done that necessarily. Like he hasn't put out like a masterpiece, but I also feel like his records are all like generally like pretty good to really good. I don't know. It's an interesting place to be. You know, maybe people are taking those records for granted a little bit. I don't know.
Mm.
But I mean, I often hear people say like, "Oh, when's Bruce going to make a really great record?" And I feel like I think he's made like some pretty strong albums, but yeah, he hasn't like totally hit it out of the park. Maybe this century.
with your book coming out the way it is, and the anniversary of Born in the USA, like that was an election year. Like now we're in an election year, and it. Well, let this be the moment, if you aren't already aware of it, that the election has since passed, and this interview took place in June. So the election year was ramping up, as they say, and here we are. It feels like a really good time for you to have done this deep dive on it, and the bridging of those 40 years and kind of where we were then and where we are now. So it's like the timing of it seems very apropos.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was certainly, that kind of fed into me wanting to write about that stuff. I just felt like Born in the USA, it's an interesting time in his career, how that record intersects with Nebraska, as well as all the other writing he was doing at that time. I mean, it was a very productive period for him, songwriting wise. And then again, just like these broader, the broader context of talking about what does this album say about the country? What does it represent about like rock music and like how things have just evolved in the past 40 years? I knew that there would not be a shortage of things to write about heading into this book.
Yeah, and a little while ago you talked about part of your, for lack of a better term, and please excuse this term, the brand of criticism and your style is drawing in a lot of this intellectual and cultural stuff, but also with the personal. And Born in the USA is a very personal record for you, and it's when you heard that tape in in your dad's car's tape deck, and just maybe like put us in that moment of what it was like. For your world was like really rocked at that time as a 6-year-old kid.
Yeah, at the beginning of the book, I write about hearing this tape in my dad's car, Born in the USA tape, summer of '84, when that album comes out, and I'm 6 years old. And it's always tricky when you're writing about yourself as a kid because you don't want to project too much onto yourself at that age.
Yeah.
You don't want to be like, oh, I heard this song and then I understood the malaise in America after Vietnam and
Yeah.
the difficulties of trickle-down economics and all these things that obviously didn't occur to me when I was 6 years old. I mean, I heard the tape and I loved the drums and the synthesizer was cool and this guy yelling over the music, compelled me, or all that stuff. But it is interesting with writing this book, and you have a lot of opportunity to kind of meditate on the album and in your own experience with it. I mean, this is possibly the album I've loved the longest in my life. I mean, this album, Michael Jackson's Thriller, I mean, kind of around the same time. I mean, those were the first records that I even knew or I was aware of as records. So I have a long history with the album, and one thing I think I realized about myself is that not only am I a fan of Bruce Springsteen, but I feel like in terms of like my worldview, that he's been really influential on me. The idea, which I think is at the core of his music, of being empathetic to people, even if they don't come from the same ideology or the same background or whatever it is, that you still believe in sort of the basic decency of people, and no matter how much you might disagree on everything else, there's like these core ideas that link people together, and it's like the human community. Like we all want to be loved, we all want to feel like we're respected and appreciated. We all have the same core needs and requirements to live, and this idea of like one America, that we, for all of our disagreements, we're still part of the same community and we're still linked in some way. And those are things that I believe in. And one thing I wrestle with in the book is coming to terms with that a little bit, because there is another way to look at things, which is that we're not a community, that there isn't one America, that there's like hundreds of different Americas, and maybe there isn't a way to bridge the divide, because we aren't fundamentally linked. The more kind of pessimistic view of looking at things, which frankly in the modern era feels more realistic than this kind of idealistic dream of America that Bruce Springsteen writes about. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to address, and I feel like that's probably a common issue that people are working through, in the modern times.
Well, yeah, and you're right that, especially at the time in the mid '80s, that the middle, something that we could all agree on, I guess, at that time, like the middle was Bruce, and
Yeah,
and he could write a protest song, but it sounds kind of happy, and it's like he's able to write about something that can get misinterpreted, and in so doing, it does create an 80,000 seat arena where everyone is agreeing on one thing, and that is the little man in the middle of the stage.
yeah, and just to be totally clear, I mean, there is no such thing as something that everyone agrees on.
Yeah.
We're too wide and broad of a group of people to have that type of total agreement. But it's the idea of that. It's the idea that there is a mythical middle in the country that people are welcome to come to if they so choose. And Born in the USA was one of the things that kind of represented that idea, I think, in the mid 80s. And pondering that now, 40 years later, at a time when it feels like people don't even subscribe to that idea anymore. That's not an idea that people find attractive at all. For good reason. I mean, there's been a lot of crazy things that have happened to discourage people from feeling that way. But, just looking at that idea maybe fading over the course of 40 years, losing relevance. When for me, it just seemed like something that was like a core part of like how you thought about the country. Like if you were growing up in that time, like that's just the way it was supposed to be. And kind of feeling like, oh, how relevant is this kind of idea or this thought? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that I'm trying to figure out, I think, in the book.
Yeah, and you're right too. How you were really fascinated with the depressed early 1983 L.A. Bruce, and maybe you can just take us to that Bruce and what was so arresting about him, at least in your mind.
Yeah, so Bruce, the story of this record, of course, is that Bruce starts writing songs at his home in New Jersey in late '81, and some of those songs end up becoming what was later released as Nebraska, this collection of essentially demos that Bruce was playing on acoustic guitar, very downbeat, very ghostly, very stripped down. And then at the same time as he's preparing Nebraska, he's also recording these songs with the E Street Band. And those are the songs that end up on Born in the USA. The opposite of Nebraska, fair to say, big rock band type songs, more in line with what people were looking for commercially from Bruce, certainly at that time. And, with Born in the USA, he ends up recording the bulk of the album pretty early on, like in, the spring and I guess like late winter and spring of '82. But he's going through like a lot of ambivalent feelings about whether he actually wants to make a record like Born in the USA. And he takes a lot of time to think about it. And in the process, he starts writing more songs. He doesn't really need more songs. He's got plenty of songs already, but he keeps writing. And this period that you allude to that I write in the book is when Bruce was at his home in Los Angeles in early '83, and he was writing these songs that were kind of a hybrid of Nebraska and Born in the USA. He's recording by himself like he did with Nebraska, but he's adding more instrumentation. There's some synthesizer pads, there's some guitar, there's a drum machine, and he's just writing like a lot of these sort of like ghostly, rockabilly tinged songs that didn't end up on the record, but in a way it was like him procrastinating working on the record. And there's a lot of those songs that I quite love that are only available on bootleg, but it's just another turn that he took at this time, which if you only know the albums, you might not have known that this happened. But he did record almost like another album's worth of songs essentially
Mm.
at this time. Um, but it was in a weird way a way to procrastinate on finishing Born in the USA.
It's you also write that the tape sounded like, this is when you were listening to it as a kid, that it sounded like the beginning of something, and you're like, but it wasn't. It was the harbinger of the end, and the end is where we are now. So where are we now, as it regards to how you first heard that tape and your subsequent hundreds of listening to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what I meant there is that one, a record like Born in the USA having that kind of impact, it doesn't feel like something that would happen now. Just in terms of that kind of singer-songwriter, rock star person becoming that successful. I just don't think that we're in a moment now where the culture would want that to the same degree that it wanted Bruce in the mid 80s. So that feels like an ending there. And then I think also, just going back to what I've been talking about, what that album represented maybe culturally and politically, this idea of an idealized heartland, which I'm writing about. I mentioned that in the subtitle of the book. It's not really about like the literal middle of the country. It's, again, this idea, this metaphor of like what the heartland is supposed to mean, which to me it means the America where people come together and work together and signify something about the spirit of the country. And I think that metaphor does feel like if it's not over, it feels like it's been greatly diminished. And I feel like writing about this album and the aftermath of it is also a way of tracing that deterioration of that idea. So that's something I think I'm going for in the book.
Was it that deterioration of the idea of this, the symbolic heartland? Did that come first, and you were like, oh, but wait, there's this album that has a significant anniversary that can speak to it? Or
no, definitely the album. Definitely wanted to write about the album, but also, I mean, they were also simultaneous. I mean, I just felt like, I wrote a book a few years ago about Kid A, the Radiohead album, and that had a similar thing where I felt like this is a great album. It's very, sort of impactful on music history, but it also arrived at a moment where, it was the beginning of a new century. And it was also the beginning of the internet starting to have a tangible effect on how we all live. So it just seemed natural in my mind to connect Kid A to that stuff, in the same way that it was natural in my mind to take Born in the USA and also connect it to America and rock music. Again, I didn't set out to write a book about America. I set out to write a book about Born in the USA. But the other stuff, I had to think about it more, obviously, but the general thrust of it, it felt pretty simultaneous to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think of that too, where, you've got to draw up your book proposal and you're like, yeah, I want to write about Born in the USA. But it's like, okay, well, so what? What is that central question? Like, okay, here's this album from 40 years ago, but like, what are you really trying to get at?
Yeah.
Was that a question you really had to kind of like, for lack of a better term, but like really meditate on to kind of flesh out what's going to be the through line to carry us through 250 pages or roughly, whatever, 90,000 words?
I had it pretty well mapped out in the proposal. I'm also in a lucky situation where I've had the same publisher now this is the fourth book I've done with them, and I've had the same editor with same editor for 4 books. So like they know me, and I can't just give them like one sentence or something, but like I don't have to go quite as fleshed out as I did when I first started. I think they know what I do and the kinds of books I write. So
yeah, that's great. Your body of work is really like, like you've stuck the landing on this a few times.
Yeah.
Just give us kind of a 1,000-word treatment and we're probably good.
Well, and I think frankly, they saw Bruce Springsteen and they thought, okay, we can sell a book on Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that had a lot to do with it. And they probably felt like, I'm sure it probably seemed like a book that I could execute to them. If I pitched something else, maybe they would be like, maybe you're not the right guy for that. But I think it was oh, Bruce Springsteen has a lot of fans. They probably buy books. So yeah, we'll do it.
Yeah,
You
well,
know?
that's a choice. Yeah, that's the business decision a writer has to make
Right.
about the commerciality of a topic. Like you could write about probably as deep on like pavement, but
Right.
but your publisher be like, yeah, I don't know, is there a Bruce book or a Michael Jackson book in you? Because yeah, let's look at the audience share here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the calculus of pitching a book. I mean, there's a lot of things I'm interested in. So you start with that, and then you think, well, what do I think I'm qualified to write? So that shrinks the list quite a bit. And then the third step is, what do I think I can sell to my publisher? And that tends to narrow it down to like a handful of ideas. And then you go from there. So it's always something you want to do, but it is one of the more, yeah, commercially viable things that you can do. So
Yeah.
and I think everyone goes through that uh, on some level. Like when you're selling something, it's a fun thing, and you also, if you're going to spend a lot of time on a book, you do want people to read it. You do want to know that, okay, this is going to resonate with an audience, or at least have a feeling that it might. So because you spend so much time on this,
Yeah.
and again, you only have so much time to write, in your life. So it's just something that kind of helps you pick what your project would be. Because again, there's like lots of things I could write, I think, but it's kind of nice to have some sort of limit on what you're going to do, like, or pointing you in a direction that will work.
Yeah, and there's a moment in the book too where you cite this John Phillips, who runs his website Backstreets, is kind of like a online fanzine for Springsteen fans, and you write that he never quite states it directly, but what he's suggesting is that Born in the USA created the first generation gap in Bruce's fan base, and I love that, of a long-standing, long-tenured artist, and even Bruce at the time was at it for in the neighborhood of a dozen years or so, or give or take. And that album right there, even at that point in his career, created, a fissure that a lot of these long-term bands will experience at some point or another.
Yeah, if they're lucky.
Yeah.
A lot of bands don't get beyond their initial fan base. Like, they have that original group, and that's who they are with for their entire career. And then you have someone like Bruce Springsteen, who on his seventh album, which is a pretty unusual thing, that ends up being the biggest record of his career. And all of a sudden, you have people like me, little kids, in the fold, or you have you have like teenage girls, or whatever it is. They come in, and yeah, there's going to be some tension with people that were there at the start.
Let's see what. Oh, you had brought up when you talked about Kid A, and you were like, as the internet is starting to move into the picture, there's this idea that you broach in the Bruce book, and you write like MTV was like Spotify, only you couldn't control what you heard. You had no choice but to listen to whatever MTV curated for you, which means MTV was more powerful than Spotify. And it's such a good point. And I read, for you as a critic and a consumer of this kind of stuff, who would you rather help you find new music? The algorithm or the esteemed critic?
I mean, they both have their place. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've found stuff from algorithms,
Sure.
but I've also found things from reading things. So I don't know if I have a preference. I mean, it really depends on the individual instance. And then there's like people that are neither critics nor algorithms. They're just regular people that you see talking about stuff online. Word of mouth from just music fans. I mean, that's a great way to discover things too. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really. I think all of those things work together. It's hard to say like one's better than the other. I mean, I wouldn't want it just to be algorithms. I mean, I think that would
Mm-hmm.
be a sad state of affairs. I do like the human element, but I'd be lying if I said I never discovered a song I liked because I was listening to Spotify and then a song came on after the song I picked, because they're just playing songs that are like the song I just played. I've definitely found stuff that I've never heard that I thought was pretty cool that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. When I was talking to Harvilla for the second time of several weeks ago at this point, well, actually, no, it was right when his book came out, but I didn't run the episode for a few months after. Neither here nor there. But I remember when he did his 60 songs that explain the 90s episode on Metallica and Enter Sandman, and he described Lars Ulrich's drumming as like falling down the stairs, and
Right.
to me is hilarious. But it also fundamentally changed how I heard their music, and I almost can't hear him drumming or hear their songs anymore without picturing like Bugs Bunny falling down the stairs or something like that. In a weird way, but not entirely. It's like he kind of, I'm not going to say ruined, but I'll use that word. It's like he kind of ruined his Lars's drumming for me in a way, and Lars's drumming is a lightning rod online, but I wonder, just for you, just as a consumer of music and music criticism, being a critic yourself, have you experienced that where you've read something you're like, oh man, that kind of fucked with my relationship with this band that I don't like. I'm not sure I like that.
Yeah, I mean, not lately. I would say. I mean, I think when I was younger, that would happen sometimes, where I liked something and then you'd read a review where they didn't like it as much as I did, and then it kind of made me like it less.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That hasn't happened to me lately. I mean, to be honest, I don't read a lot of music writing anymore because the thing if you've been doing it long enough, you start to see the same arguments being recycled over and over again, and like the same conversations happening over and over again. And it's just not as interesting at some point. So I'm much more sort of in my own head, I think, with a lot of this stuff now. I mean, like I'm on social media, so like I'll see people talking about certain things, but I don't know. I don't have things ruined like that for me anymore. I think I'm beyond that at this point.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, and it definitely speaks to you. Like, yeah, if you like something, it's like no one else is going to be able to tell you otherwise. You're like, I like this. I don't care if Rob thinks Lars' drumming is like someone falling down the stairs.
I mean, I gotta say, like, I don't seek out other people's music opinions that much anymore. As much as I write about music, I don't really seek it out. And like, I don't listen to music podcasts ever. I don't read a lot of music writing. I'm not that interested in other people's opinions on music. I don't know what that says about me, but I'm honestly not. So, I'm like, I only care about my opinion. I don't know. That's such a middle-aged guy thing to say, but I think that's true.
Yeah, well, I totally understand where you're coming from in a sense, because you would, at some point or another, like whether you're being a writer or a podcaster, you need to maybe listen to a lot of interviews and read a lot of writing to formulate your own voice. And at some point, I don't listen to many interview podcasts, especially ones that are kind of in my sphere, or especially people who are kind of like me. And so, because I don't want to be too influenced by other people and have, I want to follow my taste and what serves these listeners. And I feel like I have a pretty good handle on that, and I don't want any sort of outside pollution into my taste that would steer me or make me go askew. Plus, I get jealous very easily, so I don't like to fire up those hackles.
Yeah, maybe so. I don't know. I'm just, a lot of times I just don't care. I think I just don't care at all about it. Like I'll look at scores or ratings people give because I'm just maybe curious about like, oh, where's the consensus here? But I don't know. Like with music opinions, like I really don't seek them out like I do for other things. I can consume sports discourse all the time, no matter how terrible it is. But like music discourse, I tend to avoid. Unless I want to make fun of it, then I'll pay attention. But I don't know.
Well, especially if you read any rock criticism, it's always the same adjectives. Just thundering and bombastic.
That kind of stuff. People make fun of critics for that. I actually, because there aren't that many words to use. Like
I know.
I'm more forgiving of that than a lot of people. It's more, I just don't care what other people think about it. I mean, it's not even like I don't like the writing. I just don't care. I'm not that interested in other people's opinions on things. I mean, I think that's it. And as weird as that is to say, it's just where I'm at. It's like no offense to them, I'm just like, I kind of care what I think, and I don't really care what anyone else thinks. So I prefer to think of that as being liberated. I'm like, because there's so much noise in the world
Sure.
anyway.
Yeah.
It's nice to limit it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, I like that.
You
Yeah.
know?
Oh, for sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and towards the end of the Bruce book, you wrote, for better or worse, against my will, even I remain an eternal optimist, and I wonder just how have you remained optimistic these days, and maybe how does Bruce help in your eternal optimism?
Well, like that passage, it comes in the context of this idea of like, again, what I was saying before about like, is there one America? Is there like one idea of like who we are as a country, and are we a community of people who are maybe dramatically different in every other way, but there's these sort of core attributes that make us Americans. And the optimistic part of me says, yes, there is. And I think that comes from Bruce Springsteen. I think that was something that was embedded in me by his songs at a very early age. But again, clearly, if you look at the world today, there's a lot of evidence to dispute that, and a lot of reason not to believe that. Again, the book, I think, is wrestling with that idea and kind of trying to figure out like where I stand on that. And I'm not really sure where I stand. It's still something I think about, but I think it's probably something a lot of people ponder.
Yeah, yeah. Towards the end of the book, when you are leaving a Springsteen show, you wrote like outside the arena, the dream disappeared, and all you had were the broken pieces of America. So that's kind of a bleak side to the other side of that coin.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a feeling, like when you're at a show and you have that feeling where you could hug the person next to you because you feel like, oh, we're together here. We're sharing this experience. Once the music ends, you're never going to hug that person. Like there's something that gets shattered instantly when the illusion of a magical show ends. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get across, I think, in that section.
And I'm someone I love Bruce, but I'm not like the biggest Springsteen fan in the world. And I've been to 2 shows while a Wrecking Ball tour era around that time, and I love and admire the guy. And it's the book I just found fascinating, even though I don't have the encyclopedic knowledge of the catalog. And I think that's just a testament to your capacity as a writer to really pull someone through who is more of a fair weather instead of a diehard. So it's just really a wonderful book, Stephen.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's always my hope, that whether you love Bruce or you're more of a casual fan, that you can still feel engaged with the book. So that's good to hear. Thank you very much.
Oh, for sure. And, Stephen, as I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always ask the guest for just a fun recommendation of some kind for the listeners. And that's just anything that's bringing you joy, be it a new album or a brand of coffee you like, or, a walk outside. It doesn't really matter. It's just anything that's exciting you that you might want to share with the listeners.
I'll go with a walk outside. I walk every day. I'm probably going to walk after this interview. So that's a good mental health and physical health activity, taking a walk. So yeah, definitely do that if you can.
Fantastic. Well, Stephen, this was wonderful to catch up again and talk after a few years, and dive into The Boss and this wonderful book you've written. So just thanks for the time, and thanks for the work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks to Stephen for coming back on the show. It's been a long time. I'm sure he forgot he even recorded this. It's been so long. Name of the book again is There Was Nothing You Could Do. Great book. So is The Long Road, the Pearl Jam book. Dig it, man. Thanks to the algorithm. It fed me, the YouTube algorithm, especially Keen. Fed me this Japanese YouTuber named Aki. Serious minimalist and kind of a joyful young man. His videos make me happy, okay? I'm not afraid to admit it. He basically vlogs about how he adheres to a minimalist lifestyle, which greatly appeals to me. Always has. As someone who has near debilitating ADHD and accumulates clutter like dust, the idea of getting rid of things has great appeal for me. The fewer things you have, the less you're able to fuck things up. I routinely donate books, dozens and dozens a year, papers and notebooks are a problem. My wife and I have watched Tiny House Nation for years, and we long for that kind of lifestyle. Maybe even have a tiny home of our own up the Mackenzie River as a getaway cabin. With the constraint of tiny living, you can't accumulate things. I hate things. Things stress me out. My blood pressure today was 148/94, so things are going well. I'm trying to get a handle on my books and office space, but what has helped, thanks to Aki, is this idea of cleaning the floors and the toilet every day. For the past week, I've started the morning by just sweeping the floors and even the toilet every day, or even every other day, because there's just two of us here, so it doesn't get nasty. All that takes me in the neighborhood less than 10 minutes, roughly. We have a pretty small house anyway, but with 3 dogs and living underneath a gorgeous pine tree, fir and pine needles accumulate at a startling rate. I mean, it's amazing the little pile of dirt that I sweep up every morning. Like in 24 hours, like this much has gotten into the house somehow. It's crazy. After giving the toilet its first major clean a few days ago, like getting out an old toothbrush to really get into some of the grimy areas, the toilet has been in pristine condition for more than a week. It's pretty crazy. Best it's ever looked, quite honestly. But this attention to detail and the constant surveying of the living space really makes me interrogate the utility of everything I come into contact with. I'm finding that I'm a little less twitchy. The last few days I've just been like a frayed electrical wire. I don't know what's going on there. I've been massacring my nails, but that happens. It just does. I don't know why. Fewer things are getting dirty, and clearing off surfaces creates a calm interface for me. Seeing like counters with nothing on them is like zen. It is for my wife as well, so it's got a double whammy there. I used to do this a few years ago, but got away from it. I started a reading calendar in my bullet journal and on my Google Calendar that tells me when to start and finish a book by. And it's very hard for me to get my head around all the books I have coming in. And when best to read them, how to budget my time to read them. And seeing them on a calendar means I don't get as stressed when I see the gigantic pile of books taking up space in the studio. I'll be reading Jeff Charlotte's The Undertow starting, today, Thursday. Then this other book called Newspaper by Maggie Messett from episode 8 fame, starting next Thursday. And then The Secret History of Bigfoot by John O'Connor, starting the next Thursday. The best part about that is the quicker I read those, the quicker I can donate them and get them out of my space. If a book has been on my shelf for 2 years or longer and I haven't gotten to it for one reason or another, it's got to get out of the house. I get hundreds of book pitches a year, many of them physical, most of them PDFs or NetGalleys, but that's its own kind of clutter also. But the crux is, as nonfiction writers, we're naturally accumulators, we're researchers. We have boxes full of shit, and when a book is done, you don't want to chuck all that. You might need it. Maybe not, but probably. I doubt it. But if you're like me, I've had a physical journal since 1997, totaling some 4,000 entries. Those have to be stored somewhere. I'm not getting rid of those. Living minimally has a host of other benefits, like extricating yourself from the machine of capitalism, the machine of FOMO, the machine of inadequacy. These are all things that make me a better writer. Few things make me feel better than getting rid of belonging and giving them another life with someone else. I breathe deeper, feel a bit lighter. My mind can plug into the world better, my work better. In any case, sometimes being a writer and living minimally doesn't feel entirely compatible. But my brain is such a electrified, frazzled mess. It is helping me somewhat. Maybe you too. Stay wild, CNFers. If you can do, interview. See ya.